Okay, so aquatics. I might be bouncing around a little bit on this video because there is a lot to cover, a lot more than you probably realize. Now, if you're a person that's thinking that you can just go to a pet store with your kid, get a fish, get a tank, same day, I'm sorry, but this video is for you. If you're more of a aquatics aficionado, you should probably skip this video and go straight to the forums and other higher advanced places, because this is just going to be covering the bare minimum basics that most people aren't even aware of, that their fish keep dying, they don't know why, they don't understand why the pet store person was being rude to them and not letting them get a goldfish in a bowl. So this is really going to just cover a little bit of the ins and outs on fish and aquatics. So again, disclaimers, I just worked at a pet store for a while, I'm not a vet, I'm not an expert. In fact, aquatics was always just something that I was never my department, but I just ended up learning through osmosis, I guess you could say. And there's some basics that a lot of people aren't aware of. So first of all, you do want to get your tank first. I'll get a little bit into that later as far as why, but just trust me, unless you're getting a betta fish, most self-respecting pet stores are not going to let you get the tank and the fish on the same day. And with the betta fish, the only reason why that is an exception is because they already come in a little cup, and they can stay in that cup while you're trying to set up the aquarium. But especially if you're a little bit more experienced, it's still not recommended. It's still recommended to set up a tank for a betta fish. So if you're wondering what the difference is, so with a betta fish, they're kind of unique in that they actually gup air from the surface of the water. They don't process it through gills. So they actually have this cool little labyrinth, thing in their body. But yeah, they're air guppers. So if the water is poor quality and is full of ammonia because of their poop and all the sorts of stuff, well, they're not really breathing that water, so they don't get affected as quickly. So they are a relatively hardy fish and a good one for a starter fish. However, there are multiple problems that come with them, which hopefully I'll get to later. I'm going to try and get back to them because I really want to cover the basics first and then get into a little bit of the specifics. But the reason why you need to get a tank before the fish is because of something called the nitrogen cycle. Now, if you've ever heard of new tank syndrome, or if you've ever gotten fish and then just thrown them in the tank and then had many of them die almost right away, the odds are it wasn't a bad fish that you got sold. It's more likely the nitrogen cycle. So I'm going to try to explain it as simply as I can without diagrams, but basically you just take water. Now you put a fish and or fish food into that water, and they release ammonia. The food naturally releases a little bit of ammonia. The fish release ammonia with their poop. So the ammonia has to go somewhere. So where does it go? Well, there's natural bacteria in the water, and some of that bacteria eats the ammonia, and then they produce nitrites. Now, there's other bacteria in the water, and they eat the nitrites, and they poop out nitrates. Now, nitrates are kind of the bane of a lot of fish tanks. It's pretty much impossible to get that nitrate out of the water unless you have plants, which helps a little bit. Unless you have like a fully planted tank, that it'll reduce the nitrates a little bit, but more likely than not, the majority of how you're going to get rid of nitrates is through water changes. So you really can't skimp on water changes when you have an aquarium, whether it's a betta fish or any other fish. Water changes are extremely important, mostly for those nitrates. So that's why you want to get the tank first. And so if you're wondering, the gravel is oftentimes not just a cool looking accessory, it's there for a reason. That's actually where the bacteria hang out that eat these eat the ammonia and the nitrites. And so, because they're very dense, so they like to hang out at the bottom. So now if there's just a flat bottom, they don't have a really good breeding ground, and you want to have that beneficial bacteria in the water. So ideally, you're going to get your tank, you're going to get your filter, you're probably going to get a heater because most of the fish that you can find at any pet store are tropical, and they're going to need it warmer than you keep your house or apartment. So you want to get all that stuff, and you also want to get the fish food. Plan ahead on what kind of fish you're getting. Again, it's probably going to be a tropical fish, so you can get tropical flakes or pellets. But, and as far as the difference between the flakes and the pellets go, that's going to be a purely you choice. I like the flakes a little bit better because I know how much to feed a fish, and it seems to go down a little easier for them. I prefer the pellets, especially if you're going to have a kid feed them, because that way it's easier to keep track of how much you're giving the fish. Overfeeding is a huge Number one, probably killer when it comes to having a fish in a household with a kid that likes to feed them. They're going to want to do it multiple times a day. They want to do pinchfuls of the flakes. So if you have the granules, it's a little easier to keep track of. I just always felt like it looks like the fish are, have to kind of work it down a little bit, and it just seems like they like to tear into the flakes a little bit more easily and more fun. So personal preference, but again, there's something to be said for the pellets and granules. But anyway, so what you want to do is you want to get the tank, you want to fill it up with water, you want to get the heater going, you want to have it cycle, and you definitely want to rinse the filter the first time that you use it. You definitely want to have a filter, no matter what the fish is. And again, when I'm going to keep circling back to betas, so arguably a beta doesn't necessarily need a filter. Any fish aficionado would say, well, pretty much any fish should have a filter in it just to get rid of some of the stuff that's in the water. So with them, you definitely want to have a low flow filter. Betta fish, I believe, evolved in mud puddles, so they actually like to have a relatively stagnant water. If it's too high of a water flow, they do get a little stressed. So if you're going to have a filter for a beta, which I do recommend, then make sure that it is a low flow filter. That's something that you can either accomplish by getting just a low flow filter, or depending on where you fill the water level, pretty much any filter can be a low flow filter. If it's very, very close to the actual place that the water comes out, it's a low flow filter. Anyway, the tank is set up, and then ideally you want to do a pinch of fish food, which, as I said, has ammonia in it, and then you want to just let that run and cycle for 2 weeks. This seems like a lot of prep for getting just a little tank of fish, but trust me, this is the best way to do it. If you want to speed up the process, you don't have to wait the 2 weeks. Instead of doing fish food, they do have safe start formulas where it's actually the beneficial bacteria, which is what you're trying to grow. That's why you would want to do a pinch of fish food. It gets ammonia, and then boom, now you have the bacteria eating the ammonia, reproducing, pooping out those nitrites, and then you have those bacteria eating those nitrates, and then pooping out those nitrates. And so eventually they reach a homeostasis. So when you do have a fish in there, they're going to poop out a certain amount of ammonia, and then the bacteria that eat the ammonia are going to just multiply because they're going to have so much ammonia to eat. So now they're going to be eating all that, and they're going to be pooping out all those nitrites, and then the bacteria that eat the nitrates are like, awesome, so then they're going to explode, and then they're going to eat all the nitrites and then poop out nitrates. So basically what you're going to see is when you add a fish, you're going to have a spike of ammonia, and then slowly as the bacteria eat the ammonia, then you're going to have a spike of nitrates, and then as the other bacteria eat the nitrates, you're going to have a peak of nitrates. And then eventually, I mean, the fish is only going to, the fish in the fish food are only going to give so much ammonia, so eventually the levels of bacteria in the water are going to level out, and that usually takes about 2 weeks. So ideally, you're going to give it 2 weeks. If not, you can do some safe start. I think that I'm using a brand name, but basically it's usually like, a starter thing, and it'll just say it has a beneficial bacteria in it. And what's interesting is that I've noticed that if you're doing things properly, it actually says on the bottle that you should use it for every water change, but I don't feel that you should. Once you have a tank established and you're doing the correct amount of water changes, if you keep adding the beneficial bacteria, it'll actually make the water a cloudy, milky white color. It's completely harmless to the fish, but people don't like their tank looking cloudy. So the biggest cause of that is overfeeding. If you have a kid in the household, I pretty much guarantee you that the cloudiness is probably from overfeeding the fish. Now, if you know that you're giving the fish the proper amount of food, well, then it's probably from an excess of beneficial bacteria. Stop using that start bottle and make sure that you're doing the water changes on a regular basis, and I guarantee you it's going to clear up on its own without having to do any chemicals. Now, I am a huge fan of doing natural ways of fixing a tank that's in poor health by the natural way of just doing, sustained water changes. I'll get into that later, but I try to use chemicals as little as possible. There's only about 2 times that I would recommend it. Again, I'll try and cover it all. But, so you're setting up the tank, you get it set up, you get it running, now you're going to add some fish. So you can't add the maximum capacity of fish right away. Again, you get that nitrogen cycle going on. So what you want to do is usually start with, depending on the size of the tank, usually it's about 2 hardy fish. So when I say hardy, I mean, there's some fish that are very easily, I guess the nicest way to put it is they go belly up pretty easily. So Those would be like neon tetras, guppies, some of the more popular, smaller schooling fish. Whereas if you have, say, a platy or a molly, though, arguably those guys tend to be a little bit better when it comes to surviving varying levels of ammonia and nitrates. So you want to get usually one or two or a couple to start off with. If it's a schooling fish, which most of the ones that you're going to want to get are, they typically like to be in groups of 3 at least, preferably 5 or more. So if it's a guppy, if it's a tetra, just to name some of the more common ones, those ones are going to want to be in a group because they feel safer in numbers. So it's kind of mean to just have 1 or 2 going around. So make sure that it's a tank that's big enough. And when you're trying to judge the size of a tank versus the amount of fish, one of the easiest rules of thumb for a beginner is going to be inch of fish per gallon of water. So for instance, I believe most guppies get to be 1.5 inches max. So that means that if you only have like a 3-gallon tank, then boom, you can only already have 2 guppies, and they're supposed to be in 3 or more. So I honestly don't recommend a multiple fish tank unless you're starting out with at least 5, preferably 10 gallons or more. So if you're going to be going 5 or less, then probably a beta tank. Maybe throw a snail in there that's too big for the beta. I mean, again, I'm going to be getting into a little bit of murky water here because there's always a rule of thumb, but it's never going to be, the absolute law. So, for instance, if you see on a tag for a fish that it's a peaceful community, well, that doesn't mean that it still can't be a bully to the smaller fish around it. If it says that it's semi-aggressive, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to get along with its tank mates. So I always feel like anytime that I warn people against something, then there's always that tank that proves the exception to the rule. So just, again, unless you're dealing with saltwater, most pet stores will take a fish back if it's not going to be a good fit. So yes, try and go by the general guidelines initially, but if you want to experiment, feel free to experiment. Just keep a really close eye on the fish when you first introduce them. You're probably going to find out within the first couple hours to a day if they're going to get along. I mean, obviously the first couple hours they're like adjusting to the new environment, but when it comes to if they're going to be a bully or not, you're usually going to find out well within the return policy, which for most places is 30 days. Again, with most saltwater, you're on your own. So I'm going to dip my toe a little bit into the water of saltwater, but for the most part, I'm going to stay away from it because I'm just basically going to let you know that keeping a fish could be considered a hobby. Keeping a saltwater tank is considered a lifestyle. That's basically the best way I can put it. Saltwater tank is infinitely more difficult to take care of. So, unfortunately, Finding Nemo made it a nightmare for pet store people because the kids would come in, they would run over to the fish, they would go, Nemo! And then they would hope that their parents could get them a Nemo. Clownfish are saltwater, they're super aggressive and territorial, and you're not going to be able to just get one and then a tank on the same day. By far. And then if and when that does go belly up, and then you have to console your crying child, you also have to eat the cost of any fish that go belly up. So I definitely don't recommend it. I also definitely don't recommend getting a small saltwater tank because the smaller the saltwater tank, the harder it is to maintain. It seems counterintuitive, but if you think about it, salinity level is a huge issue with salt. And so if you only have a 5-gallon tank and like even a 1/2 inch of that evaporates, well, that just changes the salinity by a huge amount. Whereas if you have a gigantic tank and it drops by even 1 inch or 2, well, guess what? That's not going to change the salinity as much. So that's just a little teaser about how difficult saltwater is compared to freshwater. So I'd say stick with freshwater. I'd say stick with the tropical fish. They're plentiful. They're very common. There's a lot of info on them, and it usually just takes a heater compared to cold water fish. Most cold water fish, such as your goldfish and koi, get to be ridiculous sizes. They get to live ridiculously long, and so a lot of times if you really do care about the life of the fish, you're not going to get into that. So since I'm on the subject, I might as well talk about the fact that the goldfish in a bowl is something that most of us have grown up with, and it is wrong, and it is just so cruel. The more you learn about it, the sadder you're going to be. The fact that you went into a pet store and you berated that pet person for not giving you a bowl and a goldfish, saying my dad's dad, my dad, blah, 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 all did that. And, the thing lived for a year, whatever. Well, here's the thing. With goldfish especially, koi, get the heck out. I mean, you need a pond. Let's just not even split hairs. Koi need a pond. Goldfish are probably going to need a pond if you're planning on having more than one or two, and even then, the one or two are eventually going to need a tank that you did not think that you would need to have that size of. But let's just stick with goldfish for right now. Koi can just be its own thing. So a goldfish, yes, they are often used as feeder fish, so you can get them for just cents on the dollar. They hand them out for free for prizes at carnivals. They're easy to breed, and therefore they can be very cheaply sold. So a lot of people usually put the amount of importance on a fish based on the price. So it's unfortunate because a lot of the feeder fish, you'll see, they, are going to have an unfortunate fate. But I feel it's less unfortunate for them to get ripped apart to shreds in a matter of minutes than it is for them to slowly die a painful existence over the course of a couple months to a year if you put them in a bowl. What's going on with the goldfish in a bowl is, first of all, goldfish poop twice as much as most any other fish. They're just twice as dirty. So they have just twice the ammonia that's going on. And by the way, enough ammonia in the water can actually cause their gills to get ammonia burn. Before it even kills them, it's also painfully making it hard for them to breathe because now their gills are burned with ammonia. So a poor goldfish in a bowl is going to have no airflow, no water filtration. It's just going to be sitting in its own ammonia. If you're actually kind enough to give it some gravel and have enough bacteria in there to eat the ammonia, which is unlikely, but now it's just sitting in nitrates, which is just probably equally as unpleasant. But anyway, I'm not a goldfish. I don't know. But here's the thing. A goldfish, you might not have known, can actually live on average, this is average, mind you, up to 20 years. So the fact that you're able to keep that goldfish in a bowl for up to a year or so, that actually, you killed a toddler, is basically what happened here. I hate to put it so bluntly, but that's basically what you did. Is you killed a toddler, but it was by making it, choke on its own freaking crap. So you're a bad pet parent. I'm sorry if that happened to you and you didn't know. You didn't know, all right? I had to learn this stuff all the hard way as well. So please, don't be angry at me for telling you like it is. But the other thing about goldfish, like quite a few different fish, is that if their environment isn't big enough for them to grow, their outside won't. So if you've ever just taken a goldfish and been like, you know what, I think I should upgrade you to a bigger, aquarium, and then all of a sudden they just exploded, they just got so much bigger. Well, the reason is because they wanted to this whole time, but because of the environment, they weren't. Now, that doesn't stop their insides from growing, just the outside. So eventually, if you keep a goldfish in too small of a container for too long, it's going to choke on itself, is basically what happens, which is very, very cruel and unusual. And again, a lot of people weren't informed about this, so I'm probably breaking some hearts. I do apologize, but now you understand that if it's somebody who works at a pet store that genuinely cares about the health and life of a fish, and they see you grab a bowl, and they see you go over to the feeder fish and say that you want one, and they refuse, again, I really wish you wouldn't give them any grief, because they genuinely are thinking about what kind of life this fish is probably going to have before it dies a very, very painful death, much, much worse than being used to be a feeder fish, okay? So if you think that there's a hypocrisy when it comes to being like, well, you're going to feed it in order to get torn to shreds by another fish, but you're not going to feed it to be in a bowl, what are you talking about? Think about that in the long term. I mean, it's fulfilling a purpose if it's a feeder fish. It's not going to be that long of a death. Whereas if you just keep it in a bowl, I mean, it's just all sorts of cruel and unusual. So that's the main reason why you should never have a goldfish in a bowl, despite having an entire just lifetime of being told otherwise. So, yes, goldfish typically won't need a heater as much because they can live in cooler temperatures. Typically, you keep it in a house or apartment. But again, they're going to grow huge, 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 almost to the size of a football. In fact, a little cool goldfish trivia is the oldest one, I believe on record, was 44 years old. And my favorite thing, and I apologize if I'm repeating myself from my Intro to Pets video. I assume that there's a good chance that if you click on this, you might not end up clicking on that. So I'm going to go over some things. But the goldfish, I think oldest living one was 44 years old, and they can recognize faces. So they actually know who the person is that feeds them. They recognize you. So, if you always just thought of a fish as not really a living thing, as not really a pet, as not really having any personality, I tell you, fish lovers absolutely hate it if you say that a fish doesn't have a personality. A goldfish literally can recognize your face. If you could hook up a goldfish to your phone, it could unlock it for you. I'm telling you, they know who you are. They know the hand that feeds, and so, there's more to a goldfish than you originally thought. It's more than just a couple cents worth of a fish that you don't care if it goes belly up, because you can just try and find the closest equivalent when your kid's at school in order to replace it with. Don't be that person. I'm sorry. Just don't be that person. So, all right, getting back to it. See what I mean? Like, already you're probably just like a little, all right, you're going a mile a minute. You have so much to say. I didn't know that about goldfish. What the heck's going on? I was lied to my whole life. Anyway, so getting back to when you're starting out your tanks, you get a couple of hardy fish, and then you leave it alone for 2 weeks. All you're doing is your water changes and feeding them. So water changes. Water changes ideally should be about a fifth of the aquarium once a week. So if you have a 5-gallon, it's a gallon a week. If you have a 10-gallon, it's 2 gallons a week, etc., etc. You can do the math, I feel, pretty easily. So there are arguably 2 methods of doing the said water changes. So you can do the poor man's method, which it's nothing to sneeze at. But what you can do is you can reach in there, disturbing the fish as little as possible, but you can stir up the gravel. It's going to get all the poop, all the, remnant fish food, all of this stuff, and it's going to just put it into the water. That's including that beneficial bacteria, so don't immediately start scooping that water out. You want to give it at least 30 seconds to a minute to settle, because the bacteria is very dense. It's going to be the first thing that settles down. You're going to still have plenty of debris to clean up out of the water if you just wait 30 seconds to a minute to make sure that you're not scooping out the beneficial bacteria, and you can scoop either from the middle or the top. Middle, ideally, if you have a lot of debris and not too bad of a nitrate, and probably from the top if you have a lot of nitrate and not too much debris, because nitrates tend to sit at the top, and again, the only way to get rid of those is either through water changes or through plants, and plants aren't going to do too much. So you're mostly going to get rid of those nitrates through water changes. So if you have a high nitrate count, and I do recommend testing your water on a regular basis. Most pet stores will do it for free because they really do care that much about the pet's health. So you can just take a little vial of water, a decent amount so that they can actually dip a whole strip in it, but get a vial of water, bring it to a pet store. More likely than not, they'll dip some strips in there for free, tell you what the ammonia levels are at, tell them what your calcium, your nitrates, your nitrites, your pH levels are all going to be, and then you can adjust accordingly. So you do the first 2 fish, give them 2 weeks, and now you can add more fish. If you have any questions about how many fish you should be adding or what your total top should be, again, either do the math with the inch of fish per gallon of water or ask somebody that works at a store, go on a forum. It's pretty easy to calculate what's going to work and what's not. Always, like I said, pay attention if it's a schooling fish. And here's a big one. Pay attention to if it's a live bearer. Now, what I mean by that is that most fish will make eggs and then they'll pollinate it that way. Others will actually bear live fish. So those include guppies, those include mollies, as far as the more common ones go. Now, having, baby fish might seem like fun, but it's actually a huge pain in the butt. I don't know if I really want to get too much into it because I kind of recommend against it, and if you really want to, you can research other videos for that, but let's just say that it's more work than you thought it would be having to separate them, and also most fish will start eating the babies. Especially if you have kids invested in the project that you're trying to do, it's going to depress them because now there's now there's 10, now there's 5, now there's 2. Oh my God, where did they go? Well, they got eaten by mom and dad. It's unfortunate, but that's how it goes. Especially with bettas. Bettas, if you're going to try and breed them, I just recommend against it, but also, there's such a finite window where the male has to make a bubble nest, has to be able to see the female, immediately take the female away. Female will actually eat her own eggs. It's really weird. The male's actually the one that guards the nest. It's just a whole thing that, and I say this on almost every video, but don't get into breeding yourself unless, research the crap out of it. But honestly, there's really not much need to. We have more than enough of pretty much every animal, and the ones that we don't, if anything, open your checkbook, donate your time as opposed to trying to do it yourself, because more likely than not, there's people that know what they're doing out there desperately trying to repopulate, for instance, axolotls, that are doing a better job of it than you will, and they really just need your either time or money. It is what it is. So, so obviously you want to try and get, fish that work well together. Now, you're going to have to do regular tank cleaning, like I said, doing water changes, and you're probably going to run into some algae. I'm gathering myself. This is a big one. So you have some algae. Now you're gonna go to a pet store and you're gonna ask for an algae eater. And this is where people that work in aquatics start to just bang their heads against the wall because, okay, yes, there are fish that eat algae out there, but you don't know what you're doing. More likely than not, your tank is so small that you shouldn't get one anyway. But the most common algae eater is the Pleco, Plecostomus, and a common Pleco is like a freaking dinosaur. It can get up to 2 feet long. It gets armor plating, and this is a fish that, unlike the goldfish, will just continue to grow despite the friggin' size tank that it's in. So you get a little 5-gallon, it's going to be nose to tail eventually if you don't do something about it. Also, most people just think, oh, the Pleco's going to live off the algae, it'll be fine. Well, first of all, it's not going to clean enough for you to be happy with how the tank looks. And second of all, that's often not enough. They usually need algae wafers. And also, they need a piece of driftwood in the tank. Why? Well, they have teeth just like hamsters, gerbils, most rodents, guinea pigs, that the teeth constantly grow. Same thing with them. They need wood just like a small animal does in order to keep their teeth pared down. They need wood to chew on, plus they love the bioslime. So if you have a Pleco and then it dies in 6 months, and you get another Pleco and it dies in 6 months, and you can't figure out what's going on, well, you're either starving it to death by not giving it an algae wafer, or it's not able to eat anymore because its teeth are so friggin' big because you didn't give it any wood to chew on. So I say just avoid Plecos entirely unless you have a gigantic tank and you know what you're doing. They are bristleless Plecos that are only 4 to 5. They only get to 4 to 5 inches long. Those ones might be okay for a smaller size tank, but again, remember the things that I just told you about them. Don't just let them live off algae alone. And honestly, they're not going to eat enough for you to not also want to just scrape the algae off on your own. If it's typical algae, I mean, it's going to take you just a couple seconds to just wipe it off. It comes off pretty easily, and that's just the better way to do it. Just wipe the algae off, stir up the gravel, then do your water change. You're good to go. And, honestly, if the algae's growing that fast, then you probably are accidentally in some indirect sunlight, or you're using a bulb that has some UV in it. Unless you have a plant tank, you don't need a bulb that has UV in it. A tank should never be within direct sunlight, and ideally never within indirect sunlight, because direct sunlight, first of all, is going to cause a temperature difference in the tank that is not expected of the fish, and it can easily kill them. Indirect sunlight, again, could cause unwanted algae growth. And so, yeah, you can scrub it out easily. If you really want to, if it's really bad, what you can actually do is just completely block sunlight from the tank for a couple of days, and the algae will die off because it doesn't have sunlight to eat. And that's a nice, easy way of taking care of it. You just, get something like canceling on the tank for about roughly 2 days, and then boom, all that algae's at the bottom. And like I said, there's 2 different ways of doing a tank change. Again, I'm all over the map with this. There's a lot to handle. So you can just do the poor man's method, or you can get yourself a gravel sifter. So what that is it's a tube. It has a little thing at the end. You put it in the gravel. You either have a pump, something attaching to a faucet, or just the hose itself, where you can use the siphon method. But basically what it does is it'll drain the water up and out of the tank, and then you can just get right down into the gravel. And ideally the way that it works is it's shaped in such a way that it's not sucking the water up so fast that the bacteria get sucked up, just the fish food and fish poop and all the debris. Again, that bacteria is really dense, so it would actually take a pretty high flow in order to suck them up out of the tank. So make sure that when you're doing a gravel sifter that you're doing the appropriately sized one. So if you have a 5-gallon tank, don't get a 20-gallon one because it works so much faster and you're just trying to get it done. If you're doing it, then that's sucking out the beneficial bacteria. So keep that in mind. Also, anytime you're doing the gravel change, ideally you're also rinsing out the filter, and check to see how often you should change the filter out. I feel like if you have a filter for a goldfish tank, you should do it twice as often because, again, they poop twice as much. So it's usually pretty easy to tell. I mean, if the thing's brown, if the charcoal that's inside is practically poking out of the cloth, I mean, it just use common sense. Read the back of the box. Go to some forums. Again, this should not be your end-all, be-all of the aquarium. I'm trying to cover everything I can, and I'm still going to miss out on a lot of stuff. So, yeah. So let's say that you're doing everything right. You're doing the water changes correctly. You're not doing an inappropriate amount of fish. Now, feeding is a big one. Again, like with the bettas. Beta's a good starter fish, but if your kid's feeding it, then the odds are they're going to overfeed it and kill it. And the reason why is because betas don't do much activity, so they're not going to eat a whole bunch. So the kid's going to want to do multiple pinches of food a day. Whereas, those tiny little pellets, those teeny tiny little beta pellets that you can feed them, well, they actually only usually eat 1 or 2 of those every other day. They don't eat much. And so your kid is definitely going to overfeed them. So that's why I like using the pellets. And so you have, like, you can even set them out. Like, those little Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday ones, for like medication. You can even do that. You can even just, separate them into the days and stuff. I mean, however you want to do it. But yeah, the odds are pretty good that overfeeding is a very, very big thing. Fish don't eat as much as you think. In fact, some of the things that I see online or, just in my conversations over the years are like, all right, well, you feed them, and then whatever they can't eat within 10 minutes, you take out of the water. Well, most things that I see don't float, especially if you have a filter. They don't, first of all, you should turn the filter off. But, they don't float for that long. A lot of the times, especially if it's big chunks of flakes, the fish will tear off a piece, but then the rest of the flake will float down. So that 10-minute rule, I feel like, is not the best way to judge it. I think that, you should kind of, just learn as you go, but just keep in mind that overfeeding is usually a really big #1 killer of why they go belly up, because they're just going to keep eating if they have the food in front of them. They're not too smart, and obviously in real life they wouldn't always have that opportunity, so they're like, I'll take it when I can get it, and just store some fat and hopefully live off the fat for a little bit in a dry spell. So let's say you're doing everything right, you're still gonna probably run into some issues. So again, if you have the milky water, probably overfeeding, probably just some extra beneficial bacteria. Just keep doing water changes. So same thing with if you do a test strip and then you realize, okay, so some levels are off. What can I do? So high nitrates, like danger level nitrates, well, again, I like to do the water change method. So you just, instead of doing 1/5 of the water once a week, now you just do like 1/10 of the water every day. So small, multiple increments as opposed to one big water change. Everybody's biggest mistake, if they have really bad levels, is just be like, well, then just put the fish in a separate container and start all over. Well, no, now you're going to have that ammonia, nitrate level problem all over again to an extreme degree. And now you just stressed out the fish enough that they were already stressed out being in an uncomfortable environment. But now you're doing a water change and then the levels are suddenly like the opposite of what they were. That alone can put them belly up. And you don't associate it because it takes a couple of days for them to die from stress. So, yeah. You want to do slow, gradual ones so that they slowly adjust to the new levels of what's going on. So with pH is an interesting one because oftentimes I feel like you should try and figure out where the root cause is. So what people will do is they'll bring in a water sample from their tank, and it'll be either high in pH or low in pH. So it'll be really acidic or really alkaline. And they don't know why. And so, well, first of all, if you have any driftwood in there, that'll naturally lower the pH. So if you actually get your water from a well that has a little bit of an alkaline to it, if you have a piece of driftwood in there, it'll naturally keep the pH a little bit closer to neutral, because again, wood has acidic acid in it, tannic acidics. So, but oftentimes I usually say, well, what is your source for the water? Well, tap water. Okay, well, using a tap water conditioner, yes. Well, it's from a well. Okay, well, the point is that, from a well, that doesn't mean that it's, regulated as far as the pH goes. So I oftentimes will say, well, if you're having a pH problem, bring me just a sample of the water that you're using, and let's see if it's just starting from there. If you're already starting off with an alkaline or an acidic water. And again, if it's not from the water source, then yes, water changes will fix that. If it's always going to be an issue, then again, I either suggest switching the water source. So for instance, many people just use tap water, and again, if you use a tap water conditioner, that takes out some of the heavy metals and chlorine and stuff that might be in your tap water, and that stuff's great because you can't do too much of it. Ideally, you should just use the amount of water conditioner that you need so that you're not wasting it. But if you do too much extra water conditioner, it isn't like it's gonna take more of what it already took out. No, so it's usually pretty safe to use. So I like using stuff like that is going to be relatively safe. So if you have a high pH or low pH, don't use a pH up or a pH down. You're probably going to be forever chasing that dragon. Okay, now the pH is too low. Crap, now I got to add the pH. Oh, now it's too high. Oh, crap, now I got to lower the pH. So if you're going to have to use chemicals, if it's that bad, I suggest a pH neutralizer. It's this weird thing where it's a powder that you can't dump too much in, all it does is just bring it back to 7. 7 is what you're looking for, so, you know, you don't want it at 0, you don't want it at 14. That's battery acid and that's Drano. Basically, you want it at a nice even 7. That's neutral water. That's not acidic. That's not alkaline. And for some reason, this pH neutralizer just knows which way it needs to go. It's crazy. If you've watched my other video, it's just like pumpkin puree for dogs. It's just this miracle thing that it just knows what the pH needs to be and it does it. So if you absolutely have to do that, I suggest using a pH neutralizer, but I really would prefer you trying to figure out what the main cause of that pH problem is. If it's just coming from the source, well, then you're always going to be chasing that dragon. Maybe you should change the water source. Start using some spring water instead or something. I don't know. Anyway. Now, if a fish is unhealthy, now this is a whole different animal. So if it has some fin rot, if it has a bulging eye, if it has swim bladder issues, then yes, unfortunately, then you're probably going to have to use a medicine. And if you are going to have to use a medicine, please do keep in mind that some medicines actually will kill invertebrates. So if you have shrimp in your tank, then you're going to need to have that fish go to a separate hospital tank and treat it for that by itself before it can be reintroduced. And unfortunately, if one has it, the other ones are probably going to decide that they're going to have it too. So just keep an eye out for that. Speaking of the shrimp, I haven't even gotten into that. So for the most part, if you are going to have a smaller sized tank, I don't recommend an algae fish. But what you can still do is possibly do, a snail or two, maybe some shrimp. Unfortunately, I thought that shrimp and guppies could get along. Turns out no. There's a guppy in my tank that will actually eat the shrimp. So it's never a guarantee. I've had it successfully done or not. So a snail, depending on the type, I prefer neorites because they're always on the move. But a snail will actually take care of some of the algae, also some of the waste products. Shrimp are mostly bottom feeders. They're mostly going to be dealing with the fish poo and the excess food. It's just a cool little ecosystem, helper. It's not an end all be all. It's not going to be a solver. It's just something nice to have. It's always nice to have like some fish that hang out at the top, kind of like killifish, top feeders. It's nice to have some that kind of hang out in the middle, usually like some of the schooling fish. Bottom feeders are kind of cool too. You got your catfish, which are also schooling, and they do get to be a decent size. So keep an eye out for the catfish. And those catfish are not algae eaters, by the way. So they're just going to be hanging out the bottom. So again, if you have bottom feeders, not like the shrimp. The shrimp should be okay on their own with whatever you have excess, but if you have bottom feeders like catfish, you are going to need some sinking pellets. They're not just going to be able to survive solely on what's on the bottom. So that's why I don't really care for people that get, bottom feeders to deal with the waste, algae eaters to deal with the algae. It's like, well, that can't be their only source of diet, otherwise they're going to go belly up. And some of them have special needs, like the Pleco. They need to have those teeth, honed down. But yeah, so if you have, a sick fish, you are probably going to have, some kind of, medicine, because whether it's a fungus, whether it's a, parasite, that one just can't be done with water changes alone. So most common ones to look out for are fin rot. So if it looks like they have pieces out of their tail, well, first of all, keep an eye out. If there's a bully in the tank, they might literally just have pieces out of their tail. If that's not the case, then it might be fin rot. They might actually have something eating away at their tail membrane. One of the ways to tell if you have a really fine eye is to be able to look at the. Oftentimes the edge will be red, but sometimes it's just a matter of okay, well, I don't see any bully activity, so I think it's definitely fin rot. So that is going to need to be treated. Another one is a swim bladder issue. Unfortunately, this one is kind of going to be 50-50. Again, all statistics in this show are made up, but if it has a swim bladder issue, you might be able to treat it, you might not. It's always worth a shot, but oftentimes I find that they are going to go belly up if they're already losing their sense of balance and they're starting to go sideways or upside down. It might be the beginning of the end. It might not. There are some people that try and do saltwater dips, for some treatments. Again, research this if you're going to do it. You don't just take a freshwater fish and dump it in a saltwater tank for a spell and think that's going to cure everything. It's definitely a more advanced way of taking care of things because it needs to be for a specific amount of time, a specific amount of salinity, specific type of salt, for instance. Even though you have a freshwater fish, you can actually Again, research this, but add some aquarium salt to help promote the health of the fish. It's just keeping it just the tiniest bit salty, and it actually helps keep them healthy. But don't just willy-nilly dump some table salt into a sick fish tank in the hopes that it'll make them better. Again, do your research, but there are different solutions to that. So yeah, you have fin rot, you have ick. Ick is tiny little white dots all over them. So that's, once you get an eye for it, it's a pretty easy one to spot, but that's also one that's definitely going to need treatment and probably is going to slowly show up on some of the other fish. Even if you took it out right away when you noticed it, it is what it is, So this is definitely, it's not just a set it and forget it like a lot of people think that a aquarium is going to be. Now, you might have heard of some fish aficionado that has a like 300-gallon tank that they now have a self-sustaining, ecosystem in there. Well, honestly, that's not where you're at right now. That's not where I'm probably ever going to be at. And I worked at a pet store for almost 10 years, and I thought that I would come out at the other end of that tenure by being able to be a fish expert. And I was just like, oh, I'm going to have the most beautiful coral saltwater tank. And it turns out the more I learned, the more I was like, maybe I'll just stick with a betta fish. Maybe I'll just stick with a guppy tank because, oh my God, this is getting to be too much. So yeah, going back to the live bears real quick. One thing that I like about most pet stores is that they will actually have male versus female guppies. If you only keep one sex in the tank the entire time, they're going to get along great and also not have a breeding issue. Mollies, on the other hand, are usually just mixed in. So you have to be able to sex a molly. When I say sex, I literally mean telling what sex they are, male or female. I'm not a great expert on that. It does have to do a little bit with the fins that are underneath their belly. I definitely suggest that you defer to the experts on that one because that is one where I've even gotten it wrong sometimes. I thought that if the fins can flatten along the bottom, it means one thing, and it doesn't necessarily always mean that. Some of them don't always have them flattened. So anyway, that's something that I would definitely suggest you watch a couple more videos or just defer to the experts. If there's somebody working at the store that you're getting them from, maybe just ask them if they seem real confident, and if they are real confident and less than 30 days later you have a breed, well, you can usually bring them back and say, hey, that was you saying like you knew what you were talking about, and that was not the case. So I think that that is a good place to start as far as aquatics goes. Now, as you can tell, I mean, I haven't even gotten into what fish get along with what other fish. I haven't even like really touched saltwater, as if much more than just to say you might not want to do it unless you're really serious about this. So there is a lot to think about when it comes to fish, but I think the biggest one that I've had to fight more people on than I care to think about is no, you cannot get a goldfish in a bowl. No, you can't get the tank and the fish at the same time. They're going to die before you even have it set up. Oh, so yeah, real quick. So when you're doing the new fish, have the tank set up. Bring them home. Ideally, you're not going to do too long of a drive. If so, you might want to make some adjustments. Maybe ask for a bigger bag of water, or whatever you do. Like don't try to overcompensate by say putting the fish on the dash so that they can get the heat from the heater. I mean, there's been a number of ways that people have killed the fish before they even got home. But the point is, once the fish is home, typically you should be able to float it for about 15 minutes to equalize the temperature nice and slow. So don't just immediately dump them in. Let the temperature of the water eventually slowly get to match the stuff of the tank. And especially if this is one of the first fish that you have, as long as it's from a reputable pet store, it's not a bad idea to scoop out the amount of water that's in the bag and then just release the fish and water all at the same time, because there's probably going to be some beneficial bacteria in the water. It's probably going to be a decent pH. It's not a bad place to start. But again, I really hope that you have already set the tank up ahead of time. And like I said in a previous video, I think about hamsters, is that's actually kind of a fun way to have it be a multi-tier gift. So if you do have, if you are going to be getting this gift as a kid, and you just want to have it be a one-stop shop, I feel like that's the wrong way to go. Not only because of teaching the kids some responsibility about this isn't just a one-and-done thing, but also it's a gift that keeps on giving long after the holiday or birthday. You know what I mean? So Now for their birthday, they get to unwrap a tank, they get to set it up, they get to do the fish food, they get to be counting down the days, they get to be testing the water, and then they get to do the fish, and that's like weeks later. So like, oh my God, like, you know, this has been a gift that has been like in the making for, you know, almost half a month as opposed to, you know, just that morning. So I honestly feel like it's an improvement and that you can actually have them be a little bit more excited for a little bit longer. Especially once they put that much effort into it, they're not going to lose interest within a week, which is usually what happens when you have a pet for a kid. That sounded weird. I don't mean that you have a pet for a kid. Although some people do call themselves pet parents. You know what I'm trying to say. I was doing so good, and then at the end, I always just seem to just have that one little stumble, but I'm keeping it in. Anyway, that's the aquatics episode.